basically there are several different requests you can make to a web page. 99 times out of 10, you're making a GET request. Anytime, if I go to google.com right now, I just made a GET request to the URL google.com, and it returned to me the HTML that makes up this web page. And then my browser, in this case, Google Chrome, renders that for me to view right now. And so that's what we'll be doing today. We'll essentially be making a series of GET requests to fetch HTML from a web page, and then parse through that HTML for the data we're looking for. But the reason I pulled this up is to quickly, and a better test actually would be, I'm just going to pull up for my capstone project. I have a basic web app. Hello, welcome. That I'll just get started real quick to kind of demonstrate this a little bit better. But we're going to run into a problem almost immediately on Google Flights, which is to say that when we make this GET request, so I'll just send this request, and it returns HTML to us. I already know that the class we're going to be looking for in the future is this class up here. And if I were to search for that, it's a bunch of gibberish inside here that doesn't really mean anything to us, talking about our browser not working properly. And that's the same thing it's going to say to our code, because we're not really fetching from a Chrome, an instance of Chrome or Firefox or Internet Explorer. It recognizes that this is like a bot or an automated piece of code making this request. It doesn't have the necessary headers or parameters, which are things you can specify to actually successfully make that request. And so as such, it's not going to render the proper data. Also, additionally, is the problem that Google and a lot of other big companies use JavaScript frameworks to actually render their content on the page. So if you were to look up web development, this is probably actually a waste of time, but if you were to look up web development, it's going to tell you to learn HTML and CSS. That's if you try to learn any coding languages right off the bat, it's pretty much going to tell you HTML and CSS, and that's the basics of creating a web page. Is you specify the content in the page via HTML, and you make it look pretty via CSS. With all these JavaScript frameworks that are popular today, which is something like React, which is open source, or Angular, which is like Google's public JavaScript framework, it allows you to actually automatically generate HTML via JavaScript. And a lot of companies are using that today. It becomes a problem because when we make this fetch request, it now takes time for the browser to render that JavaScript into the actual page that we're looking at right now. And so we'll see that, we have all this lovely content, my amazing capstone project right here that has nothing working on it right now. But if I were to create a request to localhost 3000, which is what my project's on right now, it's going to send nothing. We clearly get the right title, BRRG, which is very much the title we see up here, BRRG. But any of this content, the link to the GitHub, this table that's currently loading 0 information because the API isn't running, any of this stuff isn't there. We just get this body with some scripts, and that's our problem. It's not actually sending the HTML to us, it's sending the scripts that would be rendered by a web browser. And so if you were to look up web scraping in Python, I can guarantee you, I didn't do this ahead of time, but it's gonna bring up Beautiful Soup, which is great. Beautiful Soup is a great tool for web scraping. During the Christmas web scraping workshop is exactly what we would use. But for a dynamic web page like Google Flights that's rendered with JavaScript rather than typical HTML and CSS, it doesn't get the job done because it's going to receive this HTML just like we received it here. That's worthless. It's just a couple script tags inside the body. And again, we have this GitHub online if anybody cares to go to it. And inside there's a link to this Chrome driver that we're going to need. But you can also just as easy just look up, I believe, Chrome driver install. And yeah, this very first link. And then there should be a download. Yeah, if you click Chrome driver up at the top, all versions are available in download. You want to get the latest stable release. So if I click that, here are all the different installations. I'm Windows, so I would use Win32, Mac installations, Linux installations. But install Chrome driver if you're following along. Install Chrome driver. Note where it is because you're going to need to reference it in your code later, so Selenium knows how to boot up an instance of Chrome. We'll do our best to get started. And I'm just going to go, because I don't care to remember all this stuff later, and copy a chunk out of this. And this code is all on the GitHub for reference later. We can talk about that more, but I'm just going to copy this all in here so I don't forget to use anything later. So as you can see, we're using a lot of different imports. And so mainly Selenium, but later on we're going to need OS and SMT and email messages to send an email message if you were to create automated emails to update you on price fluctuations. So we can ignore these for now. They'll come in place later. And I also love VS Code for all the keyboard shortcuts. If you're wondering, that was Control KC, and I just commented a whole block of text. Anywho, in my case, or in our case, we're going to be using Google Flights. So coming here, just pick the travel destination of your choice. I don't know. I'm going to do New Orleans because that's potentially where I was planning on going this year. And one thing to note is if you try to use this code, if you try to copy this code, delete these URLs, and use it later, it won't work because all of the HTML markup that we'll be referencing is specific to this URL. So if you try to swap out this URL for a different Google Flights URL, it wouldn't work properly. We're trying to keep this at a pretty basic level of web scraping. If you wanted to make it work for multiple URLs, it's totally possible. It's totally within the realm of what Selenium can do. But it's a little complicated for today. But anyway, so back on Google Flights, I just searched up New Orleans. And as you can see, it comes up with a bunch of different flights. And I believe Google Flights searches up pretty much every airline for you. I think there might be one airline that they don't search. I can't remember which off the top of my head. But it'll search up pretty much every airline for you. So that's why I think it's great for this purpose. But first things first, let's just grab this URL and create a reference to it in our code. So I'll just say Google Flights equals, and you can just paste that in between some double quotes or single quotes. C programming would yell at you for using single quotes, but Python and JavaScript will not. But so we'll just add Google Flights as a URL for us to reference later. And so now what we're trying to do is there's all these down here, but they don't really matter to us because it already sorts the best departing flights for us right here. So if you're using Google Chrome, this is, I mean, the process is pretty much the same, but I'm using Chrome. If you come up to whatever your settings are, your three dots, there should be more tools and an developer tools, Control-Shift-I. This is imperative for web scraping. There is no way to scrape a page without referencing the development tools because you have to understand the markup of the page. And so if you're on Chrome, you get this little button here that allows you to select items on a page and it'll immediately drag you over to their HTML in this panel on the right. But so what we want to reference is this list, right? So, and then we want to study the elements within it. So if we just kind of keep working our way up till boom. So this div here, and so there's a lot of different ways to mark up HTML. There's div, dividers, P for paragraph, H1 through 5 for headers, spans. All of them mean different things. A for links, image for images. Divs very general. That's all these are. They're separators that they hold content within them. They come with classes or IDs to distinguish them and allow them to be referenced in other code. And that's how we're going to be referencing them in our code. So the idea is to find unique aspects of the div, something that separates it from the rest of the HTML so that we can identify in our code. So in that case, we see, in the case of our list here, it has a role attribute of type list. And we see inside it, it's 3 different divs with a role attribute of type list item. And the reason we need to, because we could technically just select all the list items on the page. That would not be a problem. But we do want to make a reference to the list itself because this list is the best departing flights that are highlighted right now. If we were to look up all list items, we would also grab all of these flights here that we don't really care about too much. Those are way too expensive. So to get the page, we'll use Selenium to create a WebDriver. And so you'll see this first line here is importing the WebDriver from Selenium. So we can create a WebDriver, and C again is strictly typed. You need to declare integers, characters, doubles, floats. And we'll just call it driver, excuse me. Python doesn't require that. You can just state the variable's name and assign something to it. No need to specify a type. But so we will just create a WebDriver and refer to it as our driver. Thanks, Matt. So I have a set of parentheses after WebDriver. Great call out. WebDriver isn't a function, it's a module. We're trying to get the Chrome function out of it. So now if I were to do that same example, you'll see, because before I was confused because get was white. Now get is yellow. It's actually recognizing that function. But so we're to run this now. It's going to be unable to start chromedriver because an executable path needs to be specified, which we could use, but then, and we could add, what is the actual file called? chromedriver.exe. We could specify the path without issue. This right away is actually going to throw an issue because it's, if you remember, using back, at least on Windows, if you're on Mac or Linux, you're golden. But if you're on Windows, Windows uses backslashes to separate files or folders, and backslashes escape characters. So if I were to rerun that command, it's going to throw another error. Unicode escape can't decode /u because that doesn't do anything when it tries to escape it. So you could escape the slash by using another slash. But what I like to do is to just prefix this with, an R. And what that does is it creates a raw string for Python, which means this is meant to be read exactly as typed. No need to escape anything. This backslash is meant to be a backslash, not an escape character. We'll still run into, actually, we'll now get that URL. So you see it pops up an instance of Google Chrome for us. And takes us to that page. And the reason we're using this Chrome WebDriver again is because we need to wait for that JavaScript to get rendered, which is why we need Google Chrome. And you'll see there that the terminal was actually left running even after I closed it. So I would recommend ending your file with driver.close, which will close that driver when the code's finished running. But you'll see we still get warnings about executable path being deprecated, I believe. Or maybe not in this installation. Yeah, I guess not. Okay, never mind. We can ignore creating a service then. We can just get rid of that guy. If it is giving you, actually, we'll just include it anyway, because if it is giving you the warning that executable path is deprecated, typically if you're getting warned that something is deprecated in your code, you should swap it out, because chances are in a future update to Selenium, they might phase out the executable path parameter, and then your code won't work anymore. So it's best to keep your code as up to date as possible. This error isn't happening here right now, but on my desktop PC with whatever versions I have installed, that error does occur. So that's why we imported a service, because we can actually, instead of using an executable path, specify a service. But first, we need to create a service and then specify an executable path for it. And now we can just say service equals service. And that would get rid of that warning if you are getting that warning about executable path being deprecated, because now Selenium is starting to implement these services. Also, if it bothers you that this window pops up, which maybe you'll want to leave that as a feature while you're developing, so you can see exactly where your code breaks, which you would also want to get rid of this driver.close line if you want to see exactly where your code breaks. If you're, say, iterating over a bunch of web pages at once, then leave it as is. Otherwise, you can create options, which we also imported up here from selenium.webdriver.chrome.service or .options. You can create options, and then you could say options.add argument and give it the argument headless. And if we were to run this now, we shouldn't see that Chrome. Oh, maybe we will. Maybe it's not headless. It is headless. Oh, but I forgot to pass it into our WebDriver. So you need to actually reference those options for the WebDriver. So, and by the time this is finished, you probably don't want that window popping up whenever your code runs. So that's why you would create a headless driver. Now you see it throws a bunch of errors at you. Google Chrome gets mad, saying, oh, you're using this as a console, which may allow attackers to impersonate you. If you want to get rid of that, you can add another argument, which is what, verbosity equals 3 or verbose. One of those. It's probably verbose. Nope, log level. Crazy. You can tell how much I know what I'm doing. And that gets rid of those warnings. So these are things that you can do to just get a spiff and span development environment. But as you can see, right now we've got the basic code we need to actually access a web page using Selenium. What comes next is actually finding the elements on the page, and this is the bread and butter of web scraping. So I'm just going to clean this up real quick, running clear. And also, if my terminal looks different than yours, I'm using a Bash terminal. Windows has CMD and PowerShell, and Mac has whatever the heck Mac is. I also like to use Linux. Bash is the Linux terminal. It's fun. It's colorful. I get behind it. But if we go back to our Google Flights page, you remember that we were looking for these list items within this list, this first list. And I say first list because, again, if we go back to this guy, okay, I'll take what I can get. If we go to this guy, you see we have another guy with a role list. So it's technically not perfectly unique, which could prove troublesome elsewhere, but we know that we want the first list. And Selenium, when finding elements, will work it'll create arrays of elements. So we can just take the first list. Let's get back to where we were. So we have the role of list here that we're looking for. And so I'm just going to really quick if you right click any of these elements, all of these are typically the ways by which you'll identify where an element is on a page. And the ways we're going to talk about today is XPath and CSS selectors, but we're going to start with XPath. So if I were to just copy the XPath of this div and come in here, I'm just going to create a comment and paste it. You'll see it looks like a whole bunch of gibberish, but what this essentially is saying is these double slashes say relevant to the document, anywhere within the document. A single slash would be exact. So like take exactly this path. But this is saying anywhere in the document, if you can find an element of any type, div, header, paragraph, any type with an ID of this, get the second CWiz and then the div and the second div and then the next CWiz and the blah, 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 all the way down to here. That gets us to our list. This is disgusting, but very easily changeable via the parameter we were looking at before, the attribute role. So if we just tell it to look for, instead of at ID equal to this, at role equal to list, this will find it just as well. And rather than using anything, we know it's in a div, so we can specify div rather than using the asterisk. So this is our now much cleaner, much more simplified XPath. Just looking for this role attribute where it is list. And so I'm just going to copy that, cut it. And we can do driver.find, and here's the IntelliSense coming into play. If you look at Selenium's docs, which I recommend if you're learning code, to always look at the code documentation. You can watch YouTube videos all the day long, and they're great a lot of the times, but people are doing the thinking for you. You'll never learn as much as you can by looking up, the actual Selenium, Python documentation, and do specify Python because Selenium is an API for Java, C#, like a whole bunch of things, I believe. And it has drivers specific to each of those languages. So in the Python, you can go to the WebDriver API, and we're using Chrome WebDriver, and you can find all the different functions and arguments. So that's the best way to learn. I mean, it's going to be a while before you get there if you're new to coding. But if you were to look at the documentation, as I was saying, it would tell you to use any of these finds. Find element by, find element by, find element by, which works. But again, these are deprecated, so they might get phased out soon. They recommend instead to use find element or find elements. So we're going to use, the difference is find elements will, if there are multiple elements, find all the different ones that fit the XPath or selector you specify and return an array of them. Find element, even if there's multiple ones, will just give you the first one. We know there are two lists on the page, but we only need the first one. So I'm going to use find element here. And you can see here the IntelliSense is popping up with, we need to specify a by variable, which rather than using find underscore element underscore by, we just we import it up here from the common variables by. And so we can use by dot XPath and then just give it the XPath we came up with. Now, just to prove everything's working great, we can print up, let's assign this to something. Let's call this, well, this would be the list, which we actually can't use. List is a keyword in Python. They don't use arrays, they use lists. So we'll call this listings. And if we were to try and print listings, it would say a bunch of gibberish. Because listings are just a list of list items, yada, yada, yada. So it'd say a bunch of gibberish, but if we were to run this, we're going to get an error where it cannot find the list. And this goes back to the fact that things needed time to render. We're going to navigate to that web page, but because Google uses a JavaScript framework that needs to render elements, we have to wait for some instance of time. And I was too lazy to memorize the logic for this. We'll talk about it, but I'm going to copy this code. This little function here is how we're going to get around this. We can specify a timeout of 5 seconds, and we can use a try except clause in Python. What it does is exactly what it says. It's going to try to run this code, and should any error, or specifically a timeout exception error occur, it'll run this code. So essentially, if we're gonna create a WebDriver, this is all stuff we import: WebDriver wait, expected conditions, timeout exceptions, all things we import from Selenium. And so we're creating a WebDriver wait. We pass in our driver, and we specify the timeout of 5 seconds, and we wait until a list item element is located. Because this is actually a sub element of list. So when this exists, we know that list for sure exists as well. And hopefully all list elements will have rendered at this point. If this element does not render before the timeout of 5 seconds, we'll hit a timeout exception, and it will print timed out and then exit the code. So anywho, now if we were to run this, it should wait until these elements exist, and we should get a Selenium object returned when we print listings. And we do, with these session and element IDs that mean nothing to us. So what comes next is actually getting data out of them. And so what listings is, when we assign listings this, it's actually returning a new object of the exact same type as a WebDriver, which you'll see if I were to say listings dot, all of these find parameters or methods are still available to us, because this is the exact same object type as the WebDriver we've been working with. So all these same things are available to us, except now the root of it is our list. Rather than being rooted all the way at the top of this HTML with the HTML tag, we are instead rooted at the list tag, wherever that may be, which I should find because it's the next step. So we're now rooted here, and we can find elements in relation to this list. And that's exactly what we want to do. We want to find the list items. So we're going to do the exact same thing and say listings equals that, and then we'll call these, I don't know, best flights. And we'll do, instead of driver.find element, listings.find element. We can do by.xpath again and give it a div with a role equal to list item. And now we print best flights at the end of this. It should give us 3 or 4 of these Selenium web element objects. Print best flights listings. Oh, because I said find element, which is just giving us the first one. We need to find elements so that we get all of them. Yep, we got a whole bunch now. In fact, you know what the problem here is I did not remove these slashes. So it's finding all of the list items on the page, even the ones that aren't in that best flight list. Because this / again makes it relative to the whole document. By removing them, it's now specifying that they must be inside this listing objects we've created. So just to prove that, we'll run this one more time, and we should get an array with a much smaller list of them. Yep. So that's our 3 or 4 flights that we have here. 3. We've got 3 flights here. Great. So now we have all of our best flights. Now we got to get the data we're actually looking for. So let's just start with something like the price. So in this case, our price is contained within this span object here. And if we were to copy this, copy its XPath, we're going to do a little bit of comparing here. So again, I'm going to create a comment. I'm going to paste its XPath there. And then I'm going to actually go back up to the list item. And get its XPath. The reason I'm doing this is so we can see how much further into the element we need to go to grab the price. And you can see we need to navigate through these divs. Because chances are, I mean, actually within the list, there's a good chance that maybe the span has its own unique ID or class. It doesn't look like it to me though, which is why we're going about this method. It's got this random data GS attribute, an area label specific to the price. So that's dynamically generated. We would not know how to grab that, and a role of text. And I'm sure there's many other things on this document that have a role of text. So we can't quite use an attribute to specify. We need to actually iterate our way down to the document. So if we take this remaining bit, we could say, we'll just call this price 1 equal to best flights, and we'll just grab the first element for right now. Dot find elements by XPath, and we'll paste in that remainder. And then here's one last step we got to do. I'll pull this out a little bit. Is properties. There we go. In here should be a property inner text. Yep. There's also the property inner HTML. This has the price point we're looking for. Inner HTML won't work in Selenium. I'm not sure why. Couldn't tell you. But inner text works. So if we just append to this a get attribute and give it inner text, we should be able to print price 1 and get that $248. Best flight 0 find. Oh, I used find elements rather than find element. And boom, we got 248. The rest of the process is very similar. Let's grab some extra data. Or actually, before we grab some data, let's talk about for loops in Python. So right now we're doing price 1, and we're grabbing it off the 0th element of all the best flights. And we could theoretically do this 3 times and call this 1 and 2, and it would work to get all 3 flights, but that's disgusting. We're good programmers. We're not going to do that. We're going to make a for loop. For loops in Python work very simply, unless you're iterating over more complex data types. But for just a list, an array, it's as simple as saying for flight in best flights, colon, and you need to use a tab inside the for loop. JavaScript, C, a lot of conventional programming languages use curly brace notation, which I'm sure you've seen. Python does not. It uses a colon, and then it uses indentation to distinguish blocks of code. If I were to write a for loop with my code type back here, it would not compile. I need that indentation for it to know that the code that's about to be run is specific to this for loop. So we can now say, what is it? print, and we could create this price one and then print price one. But since we're only going to use it one time, there's really no need to create a variable. We might as well just actually add the element to the print statement when we're getting it. And so if we were to run this now, it should print all of our prices. There we go, 248, 297, 457. Is that what we're getting? That's what we got here. Very good. And so I mean, theoretically, this is all you need. You have the URL in your code. The way Google Flights works is kind of annoying. It's not like this is an actual link to take you to this flight. It starts creating additional forms that select returning flights, yada yada. That's outside the scope for today. But so you could just send yourself the prices, I guess, because that's all that really matters in this case. But I'm going to make this a bit smaller again so we can see everything. We'll grab a few, or actually we can see it just fine. We'll grab a few extra details like the airline. Let's copy this XPath. And we're going to go down to our list of other XPaths and we'll call this as price. We'll paste this guy. This is the airline. And again, we can grab the relevant path. And we could print flight.find element by XPath, give it that relevant path, or get the attribute of inner text. Just like that, we should get airline and price. Yep. In the interest of time, because we took a bit of time getting set up today, in the future, we'll send steps out about that ahead of time. We're going to leave it like this. You could go in to grab the duration if that's important, the number of stops. This is nonstop. There might be one stop somewhere. You can grab all these things. We'll keep it simple. We'll stop here with Google Flights at just grabbing the price and the airline. And so just like that, I mean, right there, you've scraped data. If you've been following along so far, that's your first step. Those are the basic steps to grabbing data off a web page. We'll jump over to Airbnb though. And again, New Orleans.
And we can send out the link for the get code if you want to get the code for Airbnb as well.
And I don't know what Google Flights did for us. 23rd to 27 was automatically generated. So we will grab the 23rd. Thank you guys for coming to the 27th. And I don't know, I've got 2 adults. Search. So same concept. We'll grab this URL. You have a good one too. And we'll create Airbnb. And we'll just add that URL in there. Before we use this try statement, just to kind of talk about try except a little bit and to show the proper way of waiting for elements to get rendered for optimal processing time, keeping your code as fast as possible. But now we are just going to use time.sleep because I couldn't be bothered to figure out why Airbnb was taking so long to render certain elements on the page. So we've been dealing, we got the listings from the driver, and then we got the flights from the listings, and then we started using individual flights. Now we're going all the way back up to the top, and we're going to use a driver again to get our Airbnb web page. And I'm going to remove that. I'm going to comment out to close it right now, and I am going to get rid of the options real quick, just to show you oops. When we run this, that it's going to grab all the data and then jump over to Airbnb. And it's going to take 800 years to load, which is an issue. But putting those back in place, so that it's as simple as that, to just jump between pages. If say you need to navigate, you know, maybe that's what you're trying to do. In our Christmas scraping workshop, you're going to access an Amazon list, and then you're going to grab the URLs to all the subsequent items on that list, and then jump to those pages to grab more details. And it's as easy as just, you know, adding in more get statements and fetching URLs off the page. But so now we're going to be on the Airbnb page, and like I said, we could use this try except loop, but we're just going to say time.sleep. We'll give it, I don't know, we'll say 3 seconds, see if that works out, to give the page time to render. Keep it simple. But so let's find out what we're looking for on Airbnb. Again, you could go up to the 3 dots, more tools, developer tools, or just Control-Shift-I. And let's grab our first item. Let's get it to look normal. There we go. Let's grab our first item. So back to over here on the right. Shrink all this down a bit. Where are we in the code? So is this our highest element? It seems like it. Class. No. It gets higher still. It's good to find the top level element. Okay, boom, right there, this guy. Once we went up one more, it starts to select the whole list. So we want to find this top level element. So again, we can create an array of all these different properties here. So once we find it, it's this 8SSBLPX. I'm going to copy this because we did XPath before, but now we're going to look at doing this via CSS selectors. And a lot of people like CSS selectors because if you are into web development, HTML and CSS are your bread and butter. You already have an understanding of them as opposed to this mess that we call XPath. But we're going to sleep, and then we're going to say to, you know, we'll call it, I guess, properties. And we'll say that will be to find the elements on the page by, and we'll use CSS selector this time. And we have this class. So CSS selectors, you can say an ID in CSS is denoted with a pound symbol, and a class is denoted with a period. You can also, just like XPath with the brackets and specifying parameters, you can do the exact same thing. You could say div, but you don't need the at, you just say class equals this, close the brackets. But the beauty of CSS selectors is you don't need that. You can keep it very, very short by just throwing on that dot. Or we have, excuse me, it's a div. So if we wanted to be specific, maybe there's also spans that have this. You could make sure that it's a div with this class. So we'll just leave it like this for now, and we'll grab these properties. And now again, same process for just like for flight and best flights. We're going to say for property in properties. And we will, and again, if anybody needs me to slow down, wants to ask any questions, please just jump in. So we'll find all the different elements on the page that we're looking for. So this, unlike Google Flights, which is really nice, you could kind of grab the individual elements. This has an overlaying element to make it clickable. that kind of prevents you from selecting these individual things. So you got to scroll through like a monkey. There's no refined process here. But so if we scroll down enough, we'll see, you know, this is the right part here. We now see the title. I'm going for the title if you're wondering. So as I'm just watching it get highlighted on the page, the like symbol seems like we went too far. So we'll go back in here to this div. And boom, here's our title inside this div, and it has a span inside it. This span has this class, an ID. So again, this ID, we could use a CSS selector and denote the ID with a pound symbol. However, the ID in this case is dynamically generated using the ID of the property. So we would not know that ahead of time. You can dissect the URL, get the ID out of the URL and use that. That's overly complicated. We don't need to do that. Instead, it looks like we're just going to go out on a limb and say this class T16JMDCF just might be unique to our title. And so let's find out. Let's just say that title is equal to our property.find element by CSS selector. And if we paste in this class, if you're selecting multiple classes, you need to put a period in between each of them. Because that's the beauty of CSS is you can give an item multiple class types. And so you just need to add on a period for each. I believe there's a span. So we'll say that that's our title, and we'll just try to print our title here and see if we have something working. And I'm just going to go back really quick. I'll come back to the code in a second. I'm just going to comment out all the Google Flights stuff just to so we're not waiting for it to run all the time, you know?
What was that command you just did? Do you remember that comment?
Control K and C, or just Control slash, I believe, will multi-line comment. Yeah, slash will do it. But with Control KC, you can like just keep on doing it if you wanted to, and then KU undoes it. If you're wondering what I did before with the spaces, we'll just do down here. What I was doing was I selected the first space, and using Control D, you can select the subsequent ones. If just as well, it's not just for spaces, it's just looking for repeats. So Control D on hello selects both hellos and creates new cursors. So that's how I was quickly able to insert all those periods. That's specific to VS Code. If you're using VS Code, hopefully that's helpful. If you want to skip, like here I have a CSS selector and say I don't want to actually select the second one, KD would skip it. And now I don't have a thing there. But anyway, that's a VS Code lesson. So we got rid of that Google Flights stuff. I'll clear out the console, just to cut down on some processing time. Don't have to wait for pages to load as much, and we'll just see if this works properly. Oh, it's printing stuff, but what we forgot to do was get the attribute. So we have to get the inner text of the object, but it looks like it's probably going to work. We got all those Selenium objects. So we'll just give this one last shot. And boom, that's all our titles coming out. I'm going to keep this brief too. Hopefully we can get this done by 8:30. If we do, I'm just going to grab, I guess, the price next. And then I'll grab the image just to show some fun stuff with the email later. You know, just because this one's funky, I'll grab these, the bedrooms and the amenities, because that one's a little different. So yeah, you'll notice that the bedroom line here and the amenities, the Wi-Fi, kitchen, air conditioning, have the same exact class. So you might be wondering how exactly to grab them both. I mean, you could go for both of them and then just grab 0 and 1, and that's exactly what we're gonna do. Actually, so if you just grab that class, I'm gonna call this, I guess, just room amenities, and make that a find element by CSS selector. Oops. And again, I'm gonna go back in here and I'm gonna grab the space. Boom, those are periods now. One more period up here. And I think they're divs. And what we need is not find element, but find elements, because we're trying to grab these two separate objects. And this is going to create in a list in which room, the room part of it is essentially going to be the first, oops, I have a lot of trouble with spelling amenities. The first item, and the amenities will be the second item. And this is 0 index, just like most other languages, except for maybe MATLAB. Arrays and lists start at 0. And yeah, I highly recommend learning the shortcuts to whatever IDE you prefer to use. As you can see there, I just move this line down using Alt Shift down. Very fast, very speedy. I'm going to leave this up on the page for a little bit for anybody to catch up, because I know I've been going kind of fast. But we're going to run into another issue, which is to say, well, not really an issue, actually. It's kind of a shortcut, a cheat. Is that you might have noticed that we had, I'll actually just move this over so it's still present, and I'll grab this. You might have noticed, is this too small now? Nope. You might have noticed when we grabbed, oh God, that's horrible. The divs, I can't do this. You might have noticed when we grabbed the divs, that there are still children elements inside them. If we go back in here, yeah, this is still openable to a span, actually a list of spans that have the 2 guests, and another one with the dot, and then another one with 1 bedroom, and another one with a dot, and another one with 2 beds. So you might be wondering how the heck we're supposed to get all this information when there's all these different spans. This one has 4 spans, whereas this one has 3 spans. Well, it's actually, that's the cheat part. It's actually quite easy. Is this inner text attribute, as opposed to that inner HTML attribute we were talking about earlier that doesn't work. We'll get the inner text of all of the elements. So for this div, it's going to concatenate the inner texts of all of its children elements. So it's going to take all of those span elements and mush their inner text together. So if we just get attribute inner text on this, it will get us, oh, sorry, that's the room amenities. That's not what we want. We want it on the room and on the amenities, and that will get us all of those spans mushed together into one string. So if I were to just print room, print amenities, let's just run this one more time, see what happens. Look at that, we're getting them all mushed together. So great, we've got right now the title, the amenities, and I guess what I actually should have grabbed, which would have been useful, you know, if we're gonna automate an email, which is the next step that we'll just breeze over, because we weren't gonna go over that code anyway. That's all supplied. That's not really that important. Is we'll grab the URL, which is part of this meta prop. So again, we're just gonna, and we're gonna go via URL. We're going to set that equal to property dot find element by dot CSS selector. And this is going to look like an XPath operation, but we're going to look for a meta tag with item prop equal to URL, just like we would have done on XPath. And I talked about earlier how double quotes and single quotes don't matter. That's true for the most part. However, you'll see if I were to delete these single quotes and use double quotes, now it's going to create an error. And that's because it's got these double quotes too. So this becomes a string. This URL is now outside of a string, and this bracket becomes its own string. So the reason I'm using single quotes is because since these double quotes on the inside are different from the outer quotations, it doesn't run into that issue of separating strings. So if you're going to have quotations inside your string, you need to make sure your outer quotes are the opposite type of quotation. You can also use the backticks, or maybe not in Python, actually. No, you can't use those in Python, sorry. They're available to you in JavaScript. Anyway, so this should get us that meta item, and then we need to get the attribute. And you might be thinking that just like everything else we've done, we would get inner text, but that would not work. If we go back in here, you'll see that it's actually, the URL is actually contained within a content tag. So we will grab the content attribute. So we have everything we need to, if we were to, we'll uncomment all of these previous blocks of code to where we should actually be storing all this information. So what we're going to do is we're going to create two arrays of our own called our flights. We'll create an empty array, and then I don't know, lodgings will be our other one. And so just at the bottom here, so right now what we've been doing is printing them. Instead of printing them, we could say flights dot append and actually add an object to our flights array, and we'll give it a airline parameter, in which we'll take this airline line here. And if you don't, no need to really follow this along, but if you just like to watch and learn, and then we can add a, what else did we grab? What is this, the price, I'm guessing? Probably. We'll add the price. And so that'll add it to our flights array. And in here, we've got our lodgings dot append. And so what we're doing is we're creating an object for each, and that's what I'm doing with these curly braces. Curly braces denote an object. So I'm creating an object with properties airline and price for each flight that we find. And now I'm creating an object with properties title, room, amenities, and URL for each of our lodgings. So same thing, we'll just say title, and then we'll do room, and we should have grabbed price. That's what we're really looking for, but I guess that's your homework now. Amenities, URL. And so we'll just go back through, copy all these lines. Oh, that's room amenities. And that'll create all those objects for our lodgings. Right, we do need to keep room amenities as a reference point, but the rest of these can get deleted. So now we should have two arrays full of flights and objects. So we were never going to go over the code to actually write the HTML, but back in the GitHub, outside of this file, I mean, it is in this file, actually, you can grab them straight from this file because I haven't updated it. But this is supposed to be referenceable in, I think, yeah, web scraping. There's a template for setting emails in Python where you can grab these two functions Hoya, and import them into your code. So I'm going to add these functions here. Function definitions, rather than using, in C, you prefix it with an int as what, or a void or whatever you're returning. In JavaScript, you use the word function. You use def for define, get account function as this. I'm going to uncomment what I commented up here. And so OS is for operating system, SMTP lib and email message are specific to, SMTP is a protocol for emails. Email message allows us to actually create an email message object. .env is to reference those environment variables we were talking about earlier. If you want to store, I don't want you guys to see my username and password, my email account. Sorry, I don't trust you all that well. So you can store them in environment variables by creating, this is the actual one I'm going to be using that I'm not going to open because it's got my email and password in there. But if you just make a .env file in your path, you can add environment variables, or kind of like temporary ones to be referenced, rather than having to actually add your email and password to your environment variables, which would also be kind of insecure. But you can create these environment variables. And so that's what I've done in that other file. And so I'm going to be using gm_username and gm_password, and you can assign them to your respective username and passwords. And I did this because I'm going to be using a Gmail account, but and this is, I'm going to be talking about this specific to Gmail. Anyway, back in our app, we have these functions defined. All they do is get account, given a path to your .env file, will grab your username and password and return them as a tuple. So we'll see that down here. I'll use it real quick and say username password equal to get account, and I will give it the path. It is in the same folder. So boom, that's our path, and that'll get the username and password I have from my .env file. Well, first, actually, we need to load in the .env. Oh, no, sorry. That's what it does. That's why we have the, that's why we give it the path. Right, it should load it. Yep, it'll load it for us. Anywho, so I'll get our username and password. Email account takes in all these different parameters, subjects, who you're sending it to, everything else with optional HTML text. You can send a plain text email. You should always specify plain text, because if whoever you're sending it to doesn't have an email client that supports rich text formatting, I mean, you're sending this to yourself, so you should know. But you need to have a plain text counterpart, which is the actual content of the email, and then you would add an alternative, which we'll be defining ours in HTML, and that would allow you to send an HTML email, which would then be rich text formatting. That'll allow you to add bolding and underlining and images and everything else. But so these basic functions will allow us to send these emails. So what we can do is essentially create a string. We'll say text, we'll create our basic text, and we'll say your best flights. And now we're going to go back through our through our flights array that we created at the top of the file, and we're going to add on to this string using a plus equals. And in Python, if you use 3 quotations, this allows you to write across multiple lines, and it'll treat that as new line characters. Also adding an F, we added an R before for a raw string that ignores our escape characters. Adding an F creates just a formatted string, which allows us to say something like flight of, we had airline as a parameter, and it will, there goes that error. It's going to actually take the airline of this flight and add it to this string. So we're just going to be adding, you also need to make sure you backspace it up to the edge here, or else it will show up indented in this string. It's when you add these 3 quotes, it's very literal to what you type into it. But so we'll just add, I guess, flight, airline, and we'll include the price. And that'll be what we add for each of the airlines. And then we can say for lodging and lodgings, Same process, where we will just say, what is it, lodging title, and then, oops, we'll just do it exactly like Airbnb formatted it. Lodging, what is it, room, amenities. And then what else did we have? I think the URL, which we wouldn't need here. But that's why, just like we added a text, before we come in here, we'll set HTML text equal to text, because for our flights, we'll just leave it as plain formatting. But with HTML text, we get at the same time as we're adding to the text, we can add to our HTML, use the same exact string here, except we will wrap our title in a link with the URL of that link being, oops, the URL of our lodging. And HTML just uses these brackets that I'm defining right now. And so that'll wrap it in a link tag. And so theoretically, that should be everything we need to now do. I think the function is called email update. Yep. And we need a subject. We'll say test. From email will be our username that we got from our environment variables to email. If anybody wants to hit me up, that's my email. Our password that we got from our environment variables, HTML text, and text. And so before you can actually use this, I think this should work for me. Let's find out. See if I made any mistakes. Yep. None type. Ooh, why is that? Dot slash, because I specified the wrong path. I forgot the slash, throw a dot in there, so it couldn't read the file, and so it returned none for my username and password. Let's try it again. Boom, no errors. Let's go check out my email. It's probably my spam. No. Oh, there it is. Just took a little bit. There's my email. You can see, I guess I forgot. I don't know why the I mean, you can see the HTML text came in because we have these links take us straight to the pages. So that's the beauty of the HTML attribute of the email, but the new lines aren't getting entered. I don't know why. Not enough time to figure it out right now. But yeah, that'll get that email sent to you. Oh, that's what I wanted to say. In order to get that to work, you do need to take a step. It's specific to your client, but for Gmail, if you look up less secure apps while sign into your account, and just click this link here, you need to allow less secure apps to access your account. Otherwise, Gmail will block that sign-in attempt from your code. And it won't be able to send the email. So if you come in here and it says if less secure apps is off for your account, you can turn it back on. You click this link and you just got to check this on. I'm already on, that's why I was able to send that email, but you do need to enable less secure app access to send that email. But the only other step would be, to actually go back in here into the markup, grab all the different elements you'd want to grab, and then look up timers in Python, and you could then create a daily timer. So every 24 hours, this script runs and sends you an email with all the best prices and everything for your trips that day.